singing as I go, feasting on the riches of His grace, resting 'neath the sheltering wing, always looking on His smiling face. That is why I shout and sing. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go. Soon He's coming back to welcome me, far beyond the starry sky. I shall wing my flight to worlds unknown. I shall reign with Him on high. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go. You may be seated.
Amen. Good to see everybody out tonight. All right. And glad to have you with us. Oh, before I get into the lesson this evening, I wanted to go over a week from tomorrow starts the roller coaster yard sale. And so that is Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And so I wanted to go over just a little bit about what we are looking to do and get you to see what you would be interested or willing to do. I want you to pray about it and maybe get some feedback from you after church or so. But here's what we are wanting to do. I have found out and talked with the brother that's letting us use the property up there. He is putting us next to electricity, which is great because we're going to be able to, the plan will be to take our sound board and one of the speakers out there or so and hook it up to the electricity and have speaking, be able to use our microphones to do some singing. And also one of the things we are looking for is a good keyboard with a pedal. All right, a keyboard with a pedal. And so we are looking for that. I have found one that we could use. It's only 3 hours away. So if we can find something closer, then that would be good. So we are looking for that. Also, if you would like to sing, you would be interested in singing some throughout those times, let me know, because what we like to do is get a group up. They can do like 30 minutes or so and have I don't want to say a show, but I don't know of any better word to say it, but a time where they're up singing. We won't do it all day long, but at a certain time, from this time to this time, we'll have some singing and things like that. And also, so if you're interested in singing or doing something like that, come see me so we can get those scheduled out throughout those days. We have ordered 1,000 gospel tracts. 1,000 gospel tracts. They should come in soon. And what we will need is we're going to be printing off labels. So when those come in, we will need somebody or some people, not just somebody, but some people that would be willing to put church labels on the back of these gospel tracts so we can pass them out and they can have church information on those, okay? So that would be something else that you can be involved in as far as that goes. We would also like to have cookies, little brownies. I was given permission. It's up by a store, he said, or something like that. But he said, or a kitchen will be open. But he said that he's good with us doing coffee and some, like a better word, can't even think of the bad word I'm trying to think of. That didn't sound good, not a bad word. What is that bad word? No, the yard bake sale. For lack of a better word, bake sale, but we're not selling them. But those type of items like cookies, in little baggies, that we want to give out with the gospel tracts, and we want to be a blessing to people passing by. He says that there's a lot of traffic evidently up by where we're going to be at. He said it's pretty busy up there, so we're looking for that. We could use some people that'd be willing to sit up at the table for some time and pass things out and talk to people while they're coming through as well. So those are some of the things that we're looking at. Yes, Cheyenne? This is September 29th, 30th, and October the 1st, a week from tomorrow, going through Saturday. And so as many people as we can get to kind of help with these different areas would be great. I also plan on, I told them we'd be preaching, and having like little 5-minute, almost like street preaching type messages, just here and there, a couple of things to present the gospel to people. So we're using it for outreach. We're using it to be a blessing to the people, but we'd like to see some souls saved and things like that as people are traveling through. So those are a lot of different things that you can do, and if you didn't catch any of those or all of those, you can see me afterwards, and we'll go through some of that as well. And it would be good to have as many people that would be able to come up. If you, I'm not asking you to come up all day, but if you can come for maybe an hour or a couple hours or something during those days, then we have many hands make light work. And so the more people we have rotate in, then that would be a blessing. So if you're interested in singing, or you're interested in, if you have a short message or something that you would like to preach, guys, something like that, we can even do maybe some children's things, just different ideas that we're looking for as far as that goes. Baked goods, ladies, would be great, and we're looking into coffee and things like that to give out. And all of this, the spot does not cost any money, but some of the things that we're doing would cost a little bit of money. So if you'd like to donate towards helping with that, then that would be good too, if you'd like to do that. This is the first time that I've ever done anything quite like this. I don't know if the church has ever done anything quite like this before with that. But when the Lord opens the door, He's going to provide, and so I'm excited about it. But I'm excited about what the Lord's going to do. So be praying about what you can do to help with that. Next week, as soon as the tracts come in, we will let y'all know, and so that you can come and start work on that. But let me know after church, please, if there's something that you would like to do, or if you have an idea that we can do. Let me know. All right. So I think that is everything that I've got for that I wanted to touch on. So let's take our Bibles, if you would, over to the book of Genesis. Book of Genesis. All right, we're going to go to Genesis chapter number 31. Genesis chapter 31. I want to talk about something tonight that I really don't have much experience in, but you'll laugh here in a second when I tell you what it is. But it's something that all of us actually have had a lot of experience in. All of us have dealt with this at one time or another. And I was reading through this the other day in my devotions, and the Lord just would not let it go. So we're going to be hit and miss, kind of going through this chapter, looking at several different things, looking at this from maybe a different perspective. But this deals with Jacob as he's returning home, and we've dealt a little bit with Jacob a few weeks ago about fear and things like that. There's a different perspective, though, where he's running from Laban, and they come together, and there is a conflict. And I think as I look in this passage, in this chapter, from what I see, and I'm hoping that we'll walk through this and see this together, that Genesis 31 is actually a great example of how to address or deal with conflict, even those things that are long and deep, that have long and deep cutting hurts. Jacob had a lot of that in his life. Laban had that as well, and they both were very angry and bitter towards each other. And so we're going to take a look through this passage and this chapter, and we're going to see how to deal with conflict. So before we go any further, let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll take a look at this chapter and see what the Lord shows us. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray tonight, Lord, that you'd give wisdom. I pray that you give clarity of thought. I pray that you give clarity of speech, Lord. And God, I'm very grateful for what you're doing. And I'm grateful, Lord, for the blessings that you've given us. I pray, Lord, that you would help us to learn from your word tonight. And Lord, I pray that you would guide and direct. And we thank you, Lord, in advance for how you're blessing and what you're going to do even next week and those things. But I know that each person in here, Lord, we have different things that we're facing, that we're dealing with, things that we're rejoicing about. Lord, I pray that you would help each one of us tonight to focus on you, to learn from you. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. and amen. So, as we take a look at Genesis 31, we're going to walk through this pretty quickly, hopefully, and make it through this chapter, dealing with how to deal with conflict. Some of the things that I just jotted. I didn't bring my notebook with me. I took pictures of it, and so I'm just giving you some things from my notebook from where I was reading on this. First of all, I want us to take a look at chapter 31 and verse number 1. Talking about Jacob, and he heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's, and of that which was our father's hath he gotten all this glory. So, of course, this is dealing with Jacob as he has lived with Laban and worked for Laban and all the things that he has done with Laban. And Laban is his sons. He overhears these things that are saying that people are talking about him. And so, of course, this begins. You could look into 30 and other chapters to see where this builds up into this, but we're focusing on this main point here, where now Jacob overhears these people who are talking about him. And there's nothing more cutting than when people talk about you a lot of times. There's nothing whenever people say things or you hear things or something like that, and the devil will use that to put fear and frustration and things like that, and you never always know. But here you find where Jacob, he overhears people talking about him. Now, in verse number 2, Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before. It's interesting when you hear something from somebody, you overhear something from somebody, all of a sudden your whole perspective changes and you start noticing things about that person that you never noticed before. Maybe you're not that way. I know I am that way. I overhear somebody say something and my whole perspective of what they said or how they're treating me changes, and I begin to see different things, and so all of a sudden now you see it from a different perspective. And so here he hears, first of all, from Laban's sons, and now he goes back and he recognizes there's something different about Laban. His countenance is not towards me as it was before. It's not the same. Then we find in verse number 3, and the Lord said unto Jacob, return unto the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee. It's interesting to me that you find here in verse number 3, the Lord speaking to Jacob. And one of the first things that we do when we get upset, most people, even religious people and Christians, we do tend to go to the Lord in prayer. And so it doesn't say that Jacob went and prayed to God at this point, but I believe with God talking to Jacob, I think Jacob may have gone and talked to the Lord, and the Lord said, I want you to go, and I want you to go to the land. I want you to return. And so whenever he is speaking to God, and that's what we tend to do, when we hear something, we will go, Lord, I don't understand. Lord, what's going on? And begin to question and wonder what is happening. And so when we're worried or we're in trouble, we go to God. So what I see in these first few verses is, number one, first of all, Jacob, he hears the problem. Jacob sees the problem, and that Jacob conversed with God. There was a conversation, and God said, here's what I want you to do. And then in verses 4 through 13, we won't go and read all of these verses. We know this part. This is where Jacob goes and he tells his wives and explains all that had happened. He tells them about how that he had done these different things, and God had told them that he needed to leave, and that he was about to go out. And explains to them about the dream that he had in verse number 11, and he tells them all these different things that had taken place up to this point. And then in verse number 14 through 16, we find that his wives, and this will be important a little bit later on, his wives are in support. Notice what it says in verse number 14. And Rachel and Leah answered and said unto him, is there yet any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not counted of him strangers? For he hath sold us and hath quite devoured also our money for all the riches which God hath taken from our father, that is ours, and our children, and our children's. Now then, whatsoever God hath said unto thee, do. This is actually important because later on a warped perspective comes back. So you'll want to keep track of these verses here in verses 14 through 16 where Jacob's wives were on board and they were supportive. And by the way, there's nothing like a supportive, when you have somebody who's supporting you, especially men, your wife supporting you, and you explain and there's that communication that goes on. There's nothing like that when the couple is communicating the way they should. And so here they are, they're supporting of what Jacob said. And so in verses 17 and 18, Jacob rose up and set his sons and his wives upon camels, and he carried away all his cattle and all his goods, which he had gotten, the cattle of his getting, which he had gotten in Padanaram, for to go to Isaac his father in the land of Canaan. So Jacob now, with the support of his wives, I should say. Let me just make this clear: God never intended for man to have more than one wife, but here we find this still. He has the supports of his wives, and so he goes and he starts heading back towards Canaan. Now, there is one problem that we run into, and that's in verse number 19. And notice here, and Laban went to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. So we find that in the beginning here, she's saying, yes, we need to go. And yet when she goes, she's still holding on to something. And now Rachel is kind of in this particular part. She grows into more of an important part of that. But she's kind of a behind-the-scenes character, if you will. Jacob is kind of focused on this part as far as him leaving. And then it's just kind of mentioned that she stole those images. She's holding on to something of her past. And she's holding on to these things. She's holding on to her security. These are gods that her father, and because it was Laban's father, or it was Laban, her father's images, so you would imagine and assume that she was raised worshiping these gods, and she may have been a little fearful herself of moving back, and so she grabs and holds on to those things which are her security, which are worldly and ungodly. Be careful that our securities do not get wrapped up in things of this world or people of this world, but our security is found in Jesus Christ and Him alone. And we find here that she holds on to these idols. She takes them with her. She's still holding on to her security. Now, when one person, even that person who's behind the scenes, we think, well, it's not that important. But when one person, no matter how big or how small of a role they are in the family or in the things that are taking place, when they do not fully surrender to God, it affects everyone. It affects everyone. And I think there's so many stories and so many parts of the Bible that show that. You can look at Achan whenever he went in and he just said, I'll just take a little bit. God said, don't take anything. But Achan went in and he saw just a little bit of gold, a little bit of clothes, and he went in and he took just a little bit. Not a big deal, not really a huge thing. But you realize that even his sin, of all the people of Israel, that little sin that he did, it affected and it killed multiple people in his whole family as well. And so you find that in the story, in the account of Joshua. You find also about David and his sin and how it destroyed his family. It destroyed, of course, it killed Uriah the Hittite and all the different things that took place. Our sin affects others. We sin against God, but our sin affects those around us. And that will be important as we see that a little bit later on. Understand, here she is, she's taking this, but understand that our sin affects those around us. And so we find, of course, we understand in the book of Proverbs, it says only by pride cometh contention. And that's what we're dealing with tonight, is contention or conflict. So when there is contention, when there's conflict, either one or both parties, there's pride involved every time. Every time somebody has pride, or both people have pride that they need to deal with and need to get handled before they can resolve that conflict, because you hurt me, or you said this to me, or you treated me bad, or you did this to me, and this is not right, and I feel like I've been done wrong, and a lot of the eyes, and all of a sudden the eyes come out, and we see that only by pride cometh contention. And so we find that our sin affects others. Doubt causes problems. She took her gods, and notice in verse number 20, and Jacob stole away unawares to Laban the Syrian, and that he told him not, that he fled. And so we find that there's a lack of communication that takes place, and that happens, and this causes problems. Communication is a key of breakdown. When we find ourselves in conflict, it's because of pride, and it's a lot of times because of lack of communication. proper communication. I mean, I've seen people communicate by throwing plates and things like that. That's not proper communication, right? And so, or fine, do it your way, and they walk out. That's not proper communication either. Or just whatever you want to do. I don't even give a rip anymore. Not that anything has ever been said around our house like that. I'm just saying I've heard from other people situations like that. But you have these communication breakdown, and you end up in a conflict if we're not careful when that happens. So Jacob now, he tries, and I'm trying to speed through this, but get to the crux of the lesson. But Jacob tries to avoid conflict by sneaking away. He doesn't want to go to Laban and say, listen, there's a problem between us. Your sons were talking, and I overheard them, what they said, and I came back, and I saw that your countenance was not towards me, and he did not deal with the problem on the front end. He does not deal with that. He tries to sneak away. He tries to avoid conflict. Avoiding the conflict seems to be the easiest thing to do. But in the long run, it's the worst thing to do. Really. And you have conflict. We do what we call it sweeping it under the rug. Let's just not mention it around that person. Let's not deal with that right now. Let's just not even ever bring that up. And then you're walking on eggshells because you're so worried that you're going to offend or say something or hurt, or you're going to be hurt, or you're going to be offended, or you're going to say, and you never deal with that conflict that's there. You never deal with that. And then you end up sweeping things under the rug, and you try to avoid that, and that's what Jacob was doing. But guess what happens? Look at verses 22 and 23. And it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob was fled, and he took his brethren with him and pursued after him 7 days' journey, and they overtook him in the Mount Gilead. We can try to avoid conflict. You can try to tiptoe around the tulips and all those different things, all those neat little sayings that preachers and people say. You can try to walk on eggshells. You can try to avoid all those different things. But the more you do that, the more you sweep under the rug. What's the rug going to do? You keep sweeping things under the rug. Eventually the rug is going to be doing this, and you're going to trip over it anyway, aren't you? You can try to avoid conflict. You can try to not deal with conflict. You can try to sneak away from conflict. You can try to not think about conflict. But the fact is, conflict will catch up with you. Trouble will catch up with us. And we've got to understand that right away. We got to understand that our trouble, and here Laban, or trouble, if you will, catches up. He pursues and catches up. But notice in verse number 24, and God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night and said unto him, take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. Now this is what I like about this. God, before the actual face-to-face conflict we're about to see, God has already delivered Jacob. Whenever that conflict happens, God has already put a plan in motion. He's already said, listen, this is as far as it's going to go. You're not going any further. When we're dealing with conflict, there has to come a time that we've got to trust God, that He knows what He's doing. We've got to sit down and realize that God has a plan. He has a way, and we need to work through that conflict together, relying on God's wisdom. Jacob didn't know what was going to take place. He didn't know. He was over there sleeping in his camp and all the things that he had going on in his own life. And here comes Laban, here comes trouble, and God says, you're only going this far. Kind of reminds me of Job and Satan. Whenever Satan says, I can do this, he says, you're only going this far. And when we're dealing with conflict, we've got to trust that God has wisdom. He knows exactly what He's doing. Conflict is never an easy thing to deal with, but it is something that must be dealt with in order to have unity, in order to have communion with one another and with the Lord as we should. And so we find that God has already delivered Jacob in advance from his trouble. And that's good to know that when we rely on God, God will deliver us. He will give us wisdom. James tells us that we can ask of Him that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not. When we are in a conflict, we can calm the situation down. Ask God to help us to calm down and to speak words of wisdom and know how to respond, or if we should respond at that moment, because timing is key. In other words, if I'm so mad I could punch somebody, which doesn't happen very often, but let's just say I get to that point, and then somebody comes up and they say something to me at that wrong moment, I am, now I've sat and listened to some people and say, well, I fought myself out of this and I've done that. I am, and I know you may or may not like him, but I am a diplomat. That is what I do. I fight with words, okay? Not with my fist, right? That's not what I do. However, you get me to a point, and if you address it wrong, my fist may not do anything, but my tongue can be very cutting, and it can be very hurtful, and so can yours, I'm sure. So we got to know the timing of when to address conflict and when to do it. It's not that you keep sweeping it under the rug, but you got to know when you're in the middle of that conflict how to address that. And so we find that conflict, there's deliverance in advance. In verses 25 through 30, you have the conflict that happens. And this is where we find that we can run from conflict, we can ignore conflict, but eventually conflict will catch up and will not be ignored any longer. And the thing is Jacob was there. He did not plan for Laban to catch up with him. He did not plan for that to happen. He planned for him to get away and to be ignored. But if you ignore conflict so long, you do not have control of where that conflict happens. So in other words, you may be out in the store thinking everything's okay, and you say some remark or say something, and it just happens your husband or your wife or your child or your friend or whoever that you have conflict hears you, and all of a sudden conflict catches up with you in public. You're like, oh, I didn't expect that. I didn't want that to happen. Jacob didn't want this conflict to happen at the time it did. He was already fearful of everything else that was going to be taking place and all these things that was going on. He was already afraid, but he did not have control of when conflicts happened. It's better to deal with conflict on the front end than to let conflict have control of when it shows its ugly head. Because when conflict shows its ugly head, boy, you're dealing with a lot of problems right then. There's a lot of hurt that takes place at that point. And so we find that in this passage, let me turn back over here. Verses 25 through 30. Let's read this together. Then Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mounts, and Laban with his brethren pitched in the mount of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, what hast thou done that thou hast stolen away unawares? So here we have the conflict that takes place. And Laban takes this time and he airs his grievances to Jacob. And we find this in verses 26 down through verse number 30. Let's read them. And Laban said to Jacob, what hast thou done, that thou hast stolen away unawares to me, and carried away my daughters as captives, taken with the sword? Wherefore didst thou flee away secretly, and steal away from me, and didst not tell me, that I might have sent thee away with mirth, and with songs, with tabret, and with harp? And hast not suffered me to kiss my sons and my daughters? Thou hast now done foolishly in so doing. It is in the power of my hand to do you hurt. But the God of your father spake unto me yesternight, saying, take thou heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. And now, though thou wouldest needs be gone, because thou sore longest after thy father's house, yet wherefore hast thou stolen my gods? It's interesting. It all comes down to what he's most in love with at the very end. You listen long enough, you find the real heart of the problem. And his is, why have you taken my gods? Those are the real things. Because he spent most of his time tearing everything apart, looking for those gods and everything else. He didn't say, bring my kids here so I can kiss them. Bring my grandkids here so I can say goodbye to them. Not at that point. He tore everything apart for his gods. And so the real problem wasn't all these other big long lists. The problem we run into when we're dealing with conflict is we listen to the first one or two things and we assume that's the problem. And in my experience, and I'm sure in your experience, when you listen long enough, you find the first one or two things is really not what the conflict is really about. You have to listen longer and you'll find what the real problem is. And at the very end of it, and why have you taken my gods? That right there, that's the real one, the real thing that Laban was the most upset about. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will. That's the deepest hurt that he saw. So he airs out his problems. He says, you snuck away with my daughters. By the way, did Jacob sneak away with Laban's daughters? Did he take them away from Laban as with swords, as captives? No. Laban had a false perception of what Jacob had done. Be careful of our perception. perception is key. Perception is everything. Only thing I see of you is what I see in public or at your house. I don't see you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You don't see me 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Praise the Lord for that, right? I only see you what you allow me to see you. And there's only a certain perspective of what I view in you and what you view of my life. We have a perspective, but we don't have the entire story. And so be careful that when we start getting upset about perspectives, that we take time to learn the perspective. Is this the proper perspective? Is this really right? And if it's not, we need to address that and say, here's what I'm seeing. Here's my perspective. And we address that, and we have to deal with that. So Laban's perspective was wrong, completely wrong to begin with. In verse number 26. In verse number 27, he says there was no communication. Verse 28, you didn't let me say goodbye. And in verse number 30, you stole my gods. Of all things, you stole my gods. So Laban airs out his frustration and his problems with Jacob. And then notice in verse number 31, and Jacob answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid. There's Jacob in his fear. For I said, peradventure thou wouldest take by force thy daughters from me. And so why did Jacob do what he did? Because he had a false perception. Why did Laban think what he did? Because he had a false perception. False perception, lack of communication causes all kinds of problems, causes all kinds of conflicts. And then we feel hurt and our pride gets hurt, and now we have contention because our pride says, well, I deserve better than that. Well, you said this or you did this to me, and our perception, if we're not careful, we'll judge based off our perception, not based off of what really is taking place. There was no communication. Jacob admits that he's afraid. He admits his fault, if you will. And now we find in verses 32 through 34, we find that here's a problem with communication. Verse number 32. With whomsoever thou findest thy gods, let him not live. Hold on just a second. Who had the gods of Laban? Yeah, which one though? Rachel. Now, think about the account. Leah and Rachel. Who did Jacob love most? Rachel. Rachel didn't tell Jacob what she had done. And he says, you know what? Whoever you find him with, let him die. Just let him die. Well, that really puts a bad spot because there was talking about communication breakdown. That would have been really sad, right? Communication affects. Our lack of communication causes problems for others, and it could make them look like a fool. And oftentimes it does. Brother Randy? That goes both ways, Brother Randy. Don't get me in trouble. Don't get me in trouble. Communication, which goes both ways, okay, has to be had, all right? Because it can make the other person look like a fool. And here's Jacob, and he's saying, go ahead. This is the problem with the lack of communication, is it makes us look like a fool publicly. Now, we also see, not only does it do that, but it's also the problem with not letting go of the past. Because Rachel had held on to her past. And we hold on to our past. You're dealing with a husband and wife situation, and you hold on to your past husband or wife, guess what? It's going to affect those around you. It not just here it's husband and wife, but it does that with all of us. Our past, when we hold on to that, it affects and it warps the way we view people and the situations around us when we hold on to our past. And Rebecca, she had held on, or Rachel, yeah, get the right R out there. Rachel held on to her past, her security, her gods, and it could have caused a big problem. The Lord had a solution for that. But the fact is, when we hold on to our past, it causes problems. And we find that there's a problem with the secret sin. We think we've gotten away with it. Can you imagine what Rachel thought? We find a little bit later on. Well, let's just read verse 32 again. With whomsoever thou findest thy gods, let him not live. Before our brethren discern thou what is thine with me, and take it to thee. For Jacob knew not that Rachel had stolen them. And Laban went into Jacob's tent, and into Leah's tent, and into the maidservants' tents, but he found them not. Then went he out of Leah's tent and entered into Rachel's tent. Can you imagine what Rachel's thinking this whole time? She knew what she had done. She knew exactly what had taken place. And she had this secret sin that she had done. And now she had stolen these things. She had stolen, but what happens? Now Rachel had taken the images, verse 34, and put them in the camel's furniture and sat upon them. And Laban searched all the tent, but found them not. And she said to her father, let it not displease my lord, that I cannot rise up before thee, for the custom of women is upon me. And he searched, but found not the images. Here's a problem with secret sin. Without getting into all the details of what's taking place here, one secret sin causes another sin to take place, causes another sin to take place, and the chain goes on. You find a chain of two sins. She stole it, and then she lied. And she had to cover up her sin with the sin. And before you know it, you lose track of all the little stories that you've said, of all the different things that you've done. And you keep on going if you're not careful. And be sure your sin will find you out. And so she's sitting there, and her secret sin is being hid. But it puts you in danger and causes others to be at risk of great embarrassment and sorrow. Could you imagine had Laban found those images, what kind of sorrow there would have been for Jacob? There is a risk, and the risk does not outweigh the benefit. The book of Hebrews says that sin is pleasurable for a season, but sin always costs something. You have the liberty and freedom to do literally anything you want. Anything. I told that to some of my kids. Well, you can't kill anybody. I said, well, physically you could, but for whatever you do, there's consequences. You do not have control of the consequences of your actions. And when we fall into sin and we do things that are wrong, we are setting ourselves up to be dangerously revealed and having to be disciplined. And we are setting up those around us that we love or that love us to be sorely embarrassed and to have great sorrow in their lives. All because we're holding on to our past, our gods, our things, and not wanting to let them go. And this all builds up with this conflict that we see. In verse number 35, the one lie leads over to something else. And then in verse number 36, you find Jacob's breaking point. I call it Jacob's breaking point. He has had enough. He's had it up to here, right? I remember my mom, she'd get mad. I've had it up to here, Caleb. You doing other things, so help me, you know. My mom would never say anything like that, you know, once. She did it more than once. But I've had it up to here. And there's that breaking point. And by the way, my mom's not the only one in this room that's ever had a breaking point. Shame on y'all. You know, I can't believe y'all done that. Okay. All right. We all have our breaking point, and Jacob has finally had enough. And in my Bible it says Jacob confronts Laban here's a man who's full of fear. And we talked about that just a few weeks ago. He's full of fear, living a life of fear. But finally, and he admitted to Laban that he was afraid, but finally, it's enough. I've had enough. And Jacob comes out and he tells Laban. And Jacob was wroth and chode with Laban. His fear all of a sudden dissipated and it turned into anger. And Jacob answered and said to Laban, what is my trespass? What is my sin that thou hast so hotly pursued after me? Now, with him being wroth and him chiding with Laban, I don't believe he's sitting there going, now, tell me something. Why? What is the problem with me? What do you have against me? I just don't see Jacob talking like this. I'd imagine he is probably quite vehemently, and the word I like to use, passionately, explaining that Laban is in the wrong, right? I don't yell. I get passionate. That's what and so he's passionately explaining to Laban, what is your problem? What is my sin that thou hast so hotly pursued after me, whereas thou hast searched all my stuff? What hast thou found of all thy household stuff? Set it here before my brethren and thy brethren, that they may judge betwixt us both. This 20 years, oh boy, he lets Laban have it right here. This 20 years have I been with thee. Thy ewes and thy she goats have not cast their young, and the rams of thy flock have I not eaten. That which was torn of beasts I brought not unto thee. I bear the loss of it. Of my hand didst thou require it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. Thus I was in the day the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from mine eyes. Thus have I been 20 years in thy house. I served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, and 6 years for thy cattle. And thou hast changed my wages 10 times, except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had been with me. Surely thou hadst sent me away now empty. God hath seen my affliction and the labor of my hands, and rebuked thee yesternight. That's not, I just put that in there. But that's what Jacob said. I mean, have you thought about how angry Jacob was at this point? And all the things, I mean, he land blasted. All of a sudden, Laban comes and he tells him, well, you've done this, and you've done this, and you've done this. And Jacob says, I'll tell you what you've done to me. You've come into my house. You've come into my privacy. You have invaded all that I've got going on. And you have done all these things, and you have found nothing wrong with me. And he gets angry, and you have that conflict all of a sudden. Bam. Because it wasn't dealt with at the first. And you have this hot conflict that takes place. It's interesting that God uses a potentially bad situation to help Jacob become bold. It's as though Jacob said, you can say whatever you want to about me, but you're not going to say anything about my family and my wife and come into my house and do all that stuff. And that was Jacob's breaking point. He said, that's what he started out with. You came into my place and you didn't find any of your stuff. You went into all the places and you found nothing. We don't always know the tools that God uses to help us grow. We always like the tools that are nice and kind, but sometimes God has to use those bad situations to help us to grow in Him. And so we find in this passage that Jacob defends himself and he airs his grievances. He says, you invaded my privacy and found nothing. I was an upstanding employee for 20 years. In verse number 38 and verse 39, I bore the loss of your business. That was the first part of verse 39. Verse 39b, you required me to pay for things that I could not help. Verse number 40, I was under harsh working conditions. And he airs all of these out to Laban and tells him, these are all the things that I've gone through. Verse number 41, you treated me unfairly. You changed my wages 10 times. I'm assuming he didn't get a raise every time that he changed his wages, because that would not have been said. Oh, well, you don't just bring up positive things when you're in the middle of arguing with somebody. Well, by the way, you increased my wages 10 times. These are things that he felt like had been unfair to him. You had treated me unfairly. And he says, and by the way, verse 42, and he uses, Laban has said, your God came to me last night and said not to do anything. And he says, and if it weren't for God stepping in, you would take everything back and send me away with nothing. Now, at this point, when the conversation gets the hottest and the hardest, and both people are red in their face and they're ready to spew at each other, this is where most people storm out and leave and say, you know what, just forget it. And they walk away. And guess what happens next time they see them? That same feeling comes right back. Maybe it doesn't to you, but for me, if I end with somebody and I don't work through that, and I see it, I end at that high emotional point of anger or frustration, every time I see that person, my emotion just like that, because last conversation we had was rough. Maybe not everybody's like that. I know that's how I am. I find myself a lot like with Jacob. He finally had the point. But this is where most people just stop and they say, let's just walk away. And they come back and there they are every time they see each other. That's why you have people at churches that attend the same church, but they can't get along, and they had the big argument at church or at home or wherever, and every time they see them in the grocery aisle, right, they're ducking so they don't see the next person because they don't. Why? Because they ended, the last conversation they had was not a good conversation. And they don't want to deal with it. They're trying to hide from their conflicts, and they say, you know what, let's just leave it alone. Let's just brush it under the rug. But notice verses number 43 and 44, they don't just stomp off and leave. They don't get angry and just walk away. And Laban answered. There's an answer that takes place. And said unto Jacob, these daughters are my daughters, and these children are my children, and these cattle are my cattle, and all that thou seest is mine. And what can I do this day unto thee, my daughters, unto these my daughters, or unto their children, which they have borne? Now therefore come thou, let us make a covenant, I and thou, and let it be a witness between me and thee. He saw it all the way through that, what I call the brick wall. And he had to bust through that brick wall. It was Laban who had to see and says, these are my daughters. These kids are my kids. These are my grandkids. Everything that's here was mine at one point. But what can I do? So what we need to do is we need to find a solution. And if you never find a solution to your conflict, you'll always walk around in conflict and anger and frustration and irritation and all the other words that go along with that. Unresolved conflict breeds bitterness. And it hurts. It hurts you, and it hurts those around you, and it hurts everybody when you're walking around with unresolved conflict. Well, we'll talk about that later. Or we'll deal with that later. Well, I don't want to deal with that. Well, we get angry. Listen, I've been in enough conflict with some of y'all in here that we know. Greg and I have had several times of conflict. He was always wrong, just so y'all know. I was right. And it came out in the end. But the fact is, you have to break through that brick wall. You have to come to a resolution. You can't just walk away just because you get angry. You have to stop and say, you know what? Let's stop and just think about this for a second. Before, and I don't know how many of y'all feel this way, but I can feel my anger starting at the bottom of my toes and working up to my knees and up to my belly and up, and my face starts turning red. And I'm like that thermometer that he have. I can feel it rising. I don't know if y'all are that way or not, but I'm like a thermometer. And I have been told by my wife and others that they can actually see. I think it's my ears or something that give me away. But there's some type of facial thing that they can actually tell whenever I'm getting angry because of the way my facial expressions, and I'm like a thermometer, and so I can feel it. And so before the thermometer gets up to here, I had better start thinking about a solution, because when it gets to here, my brain is out of the conversation. It just starts reacting in the flesh. But you've got to start dealing with conflict. I say you, let me rephrase that. We in our lives have to deal with conflict. And the fact is that it is a part of life, and we've got to learn how to deal with it biblically and effectively. And we're wrapping up. Laban offers a peaceful solution. Let it be a covenant with us. Let's stop this. Let's put an end to this, and let's have a peaceful solution. He worked all the way to the end, to the peaceful solution that there could have been, that there was. And that's what we need to do with the conflict. We don't walk away still angry. We deal with it all the way to the end, even though it's difficult. And look at verses 45 through 48. And Jacob took a stone and set it up for a pillar. And Jacob said unto his brethren, gather stones. And they took stones and made an heap. And they did eat there upon the heap. And Laban called it... Rick, you want to try to pronounce that for me? Okay. Jegar said Sahudetha. Thank you, brother. I appreciate it. Everybody's like, what? You speaking in tongues now? No. All right. But Jacob called it Gilead. I like that name a lot better. Called it Gilead. And Laban said, this heap is a witness between me and thee this day. Therefore was the name of it called Gilead. And so we find in this passage here that they went from a conflict to a resolution. And you know what they did at the end? They ate upon that. They fellowshipped. together. That's when you know a conflict is ended. When you have that peaceful ending and you can actually come back together and fellowship with one another. Don't stop. You have to deal with that conflict. You come back to that peaceful resolution and you can still come back to the table with one another and say, God has restored us. Work through the conflict until the resolution, until the restoration is complete, just like Laban and just like Jacob had to. And they set that up. And we won't read the rest of that chapter, but we find in verses 49 through 53, they leave the past in God's hands. And in verse number 54, we find this, that they left the past where it belonged. Then Jacob offered sacrifice upon the mount and called his brethren to eat bread, and they did eat bread and tarried all night in the mount. It went from a conflict to a party. How would you like to have a conflict like that ends out that way? They dealt all night with them. And early in the morning, verse 55, ending at this, Laban rose up and kissed his sons and his daughters and blessed them. And Laban departed and returned unto his place. Laban got what he wanted. He had to go all the way through that conflict. They left the past where it belonged. When you resolve conflict, truly resolve conflict, that's got to be left in the past, not to bring back up. Well, I know, but you remember when? And I'm like, and you're like, hold on. Well, I thought we dealt with that already. And I've been guilty of bringing up things, and I've been having to be told, well, now, hold on, we already dealt with that. And we've all had that problem. And true conflict that's been resolved is left in the past, not to be brought up again. When there is conflict, it is best to sit and have the hard conversations on the front side rather than risk relationships, peace, and joy. It's better to sit down on the front side of conflict. And finally, this last statement. It is difficult. It is difficult to work through the problem, yet the peace on the other side is worth the pain of growing. And that's what we need when we're dealing with conflict. And what a great lesson Genesis 31 is about dealing with conflict. I had never seen that quite that way until just recently I was reading through there. So next time you read through Genesis 31, see the conflict and see how to deal with it, and find that there is a good biblical way to deal with conflict and to move on and let God grow us. Well, it is already 7:30. I went way longer than I was supposed to. Why don't we be just dismissed this evening with a word of prayer, okay? Dear Heavenly Father, I come to you tonight for just thanking you for your goodness. And Lord, I went longer tonight than what I intended to. I'm sorry. But Lord, I pray that as we're talking about this evening, trying to get through that whole chapter, dealing with conflict the way you'd have us to, I pray, Lord, you'd help us to take notes and to listen and to learn. And if we have conflict, Lord, you know, just in the past few months, few weeks, few days, Lord, there's been conflict in my own life that I've had to deal with, and you've helped, and you've given peace and strength. And Lord, there's things that we're having to deal with, and it's part of life. And so, Lord, I pray if there's anybody in this room that has those feelings of conflict and anger and frustration, and when that conflict comes, because it will come in life, Lord, help us to stop and to work through it the way we should, and not to give up on each other, not to give up on our brothers and sisters. But Lord, that you'd help us to work through that till we come to a peaceful end and a joyous conclusion where we can once again fellowship and enjoy each other's company. Lord, that's what you desire for us. And so, Lord, it's a growing time. So when that conflict arises, Lord, whoever may be dealing with conflict tonight, maybe nobody is, but I'd imagine in the room this size, there's people that has conflict at home, or maybe conflict at work, or with friends, or, Lord, with people out and about, Lord, in the community and neighbors, and whoever that is, and whatever it is you're dealing with in their conflicts of life, Lord, help them to handle it biblically, because we can have a great testimony when we do. We thank you, we praise you, Lord, for all you've done for us. In Jesus'